No one ever plays at 20th level anyway, and most campaigns are done by 10th level. How many times have you monoclassed X class? These are the kinds of things that you hear all the time when discussing D&D and the game's overall design. This is a conversation that I find to be fascinating because it touches on an often overlooked element of the game. The fact that late game high level features, things that like 0.1% of the player base will ever use, actually has a massive impact on our perception of the early game and how people plan and build their characters. Most recently, this discussion came to a head when we saw the reveal of the 2024 Ranger, where the team made some questionable decisions. This has led to a lot of complaints, but also to a seemingly equal number of people saying that it doesn't matter since you were probably going to multiclass out of Ranger anyway. This then begs the question, if the intent is for you to drop out of the class, why bother making 20 levels of features for it, or why bother with the class at all? So that clearly isn't the intention. Anyway, this is a video that I've been trying to write for like 6 months, so let's finally talk about the invisible hand that is late game D&D and how it impacts our gameplay and character decisions. I do want to be clear though that this video is not intended to just rip on the new Ranger at all, but I will be referencing some of the design decisions and using it as a little bit of a case study. Social Blade now projects that I'll hit my goal of 10,000 subscribers just 1 day short of my target of the release of the new Player's Handbook on September 17th. So if you like what I do, a sub to the channel would really mean a lot. Thank you so much. As always, a huge shout out to all of my members, but especially to those in the champion tier, Julian, Corel, and Finicky. I could not do this without your and all of my members' support, so if you'd like to help me out and join the channel for as little as $1 per month, click on the join button to see all the fun benefits. Before we get too far, I should probably explain what I mean about the invisible hand of D&D. What I'm referring to is the presence of certain features, or lack thereof, that suggest to a player that there isn't much of a reason to continue straight classing. Because, let's be real, most players aren't dying for Tireless Body, Superior Inspiration, Brutal Critical 3 times, Slippery Mind, or a CR4 Destroy Undead. To be super clear, I'm not saying that these features are necessarily bad and that you shouldn't straight class if you want to. What I am saying is that potentially spending years and years playing a rogue just to get proficiency in wisdom saving throws at 15th level doesn't feel like the most worthwhile investment. This is what I'm talking about with the invisible hand, that the knowing of how your class progresses informs how most people will play and build out their characters. These features are the hands that nudge you in another direction and shape what we largely consider to be the quote-unquote meta of the game. So why does D&D have 20 levels? According to Jeremy Crawford, based on all of the data that they have accumulated through surveys, focus groups, and probably D&D Beyond, the vast majority of play ends by 10th level. In an interview with Christian Hoffer of comicbook.com, he states that this data point is not only true for 5th edition, but has been true for as long as they've been getting data on the subject. He confirms that this was also the case in both 3rd and 4th editions, as well as in 5e, and he suggested if they had data from 1st and 2nd edition, that he suspects that it would be the same. So the question then becomes, why bother with 20 levels then? And the answer is, because it's aspirational. This now is kind of a complicated response. At face value, it implies that by being aspirational, they don't expect many people to actually play at this level, which effectively means that they don't need to care too much about it, because since so few people are going to get there anyway, it doesn't really matter. The thing is though, at the same time, by their own admission, high level play is aspirational. Players are going to look at their 20th level feature even if they're never gonna get it, because it helps inform them about the class and the possibility of playing that long and the power that they might amass by doing so. And if they do that, you can be sure that once they've read the Bard's 20th level Superior Inspiration feature, especially after probably just reading the Barbarian's Primal Champion one, they probably aren't going to be feeling all too great about it. And the thing is though, that people do in fact play at 20th level. My campaign right now is playing at 20th level. It's wild and chaotic and barely makes sense at times, but we love it for what it is. And the thing is, Jeremy Crawford is right. It's aspirational, at least for us. We all wanted to play a game that went the distance, and it took us over 4 years, but we got there. We didn't needlessly extend stories or force the game to get there, but when we started our campaign, we knew that it was going to be a long one, and always had the thought that if this goes to 20, it's gonna be wild, and it was. Playing at 20th level, or knowing that your game is going to go long, gives you a very different perspective that you might otherwise not have on your game and character. It allows you to make a decision knowing that you're going to have a lot of opportunities to get to use a certain spell or feat, Or you can focus in on exactly what you want your endgame build to look like, knowing that you will actually arrive there. Or you can just see where the adventure takes you and make decisions along the way. None of these methods are inherently right or wrong, they're all different but are all great side benefits of playing a game that goes super late. On the flip side though, if you're playing a campaign that doesn't intend to go long or is a pre-written module, or if it just ends up ending early because, as everyone knows, tons of games just don't work out for myriad reasons, you become more encouraged, from a power perspective at least, to dip into other classes or optimize in different ways because you just don't necessarily have the luxury of time on your side. This balancing act is a huge element of why classes in 5th edition are so heavily front-loaded. Because games often don't go long and because most players begin at early levels, typically 1st or 3rd, the designers have made the decision to grant your character most of their signature flashy abilities toward the beginning of character progression so that you can experience them earlier and for longer. This has a few benefits. It helps define the class and give them something that feels unique. It also provides reasons to stick with a class to unlock or improve a given feature, but most importantly, it just means that you get to play with your cool toys. So with all of that in mind, I do want to take a few minutes to discuss the revised 2024 Ranger and go into a bit more detail about why I think the design of the class is problematic. Spoilers, it has absolutely nothing to do with power. The class is very strong, stronger than its 2014 version and even more than the quasi-updated version that we saw in Tasha's. It's a much bigger picture question than that. There's two main responses that I have seen in regard to the design of the 2024 Ranger. First is that the later stage Ranger features don't matter that much since very few people straight class and even fewer people would bother to straight class a Ranger. As a result, the implication is that the fixation on Hunter's Mark as an element of the core class identity is irrelevant since a player isn't really sacrificing a whole lot once they drop out of the class just a few levels later. The second is that there's just better spells to cast than Hunter's Mark, so just cast those and don't worry about it. And the thing is, there's an element of truth to both of these things. If you are interested in maximizing the power of your character, you probably weren't going to be straight classing a Ranger. I mean, you probably weren't going to be straight classing anything for that matter, since on average, multi-classing will often give you more bang for your buck at certain levels depending on what build you're trying to go for. And yeah, there almost certainly will be at various points throughout your adventuring career a quote-unquote better spell to cast than Hunter's Mark. But that doesn't make it feel any better when you just watch like half of your class features wither away. The point that I'm trying to make is that as true as both of these things might be, the fact remains that designing an entire class, one of the most fundamental and core elements of the game that players will interact with, around the assumption that they will either dip out of the class or play in a way that's incongruent with that class design, is doing a disservice to everyone. And if you're the type of player that knows that they want to just dip into Ranger for one level because it offers a lot of value, that's fine. Nothing I'm discussing takes away from that at all. Instead, it just asks the question of why that is the better thing to do. Why has the class been structured in such a way that veteran players see little to no value in later progressions of the class, impliedly acknowledging the flawed design? It's not about whether the new Ranger is good or bad, or whether Hunter's Mark is good or bad, or whether the features that stack on top of Hunter's Mark are good or bad. None of these things are relevant to the discussion at all. The question is whether or not designing an entire class around a single spell that requires concentration was a good design decision. I'm of a mind that it was not. There are precious few features in the game that actively prevent you from engaging with other core game mechanics. Barbarian's Rage is one, however, while it prevents you from engaging with spellcasting, at least your class wasn't also given spellcasting as a core feature at literally the same level. Some other examples could be things like unarmored defense or unarmored movement, but the 2024 Ranger now gives you spellcasting at first level and simultaneously gives you a feature that functionally says if you don't use Hunter's Mark, more or less the back half of your character progression is forfeit. 3 additional class features, Relentless Hunter, Precise Hunter, and maybe most egregiously, the Capstone, Foe Slayer, are all dependent on the use of Hunter's Mark, and at no point during any of these progressions does the spell become concentration free. This also doesn't even consider the multitude of other Hunter's Mark related features associated with the Beastmaster and the Hunter subclass. Again, this isn't a power question, it's a design question. Sure, all of the Hunter's Mark related features come relatively late in the Ranger's progression, but does that make them less important? Fewer people are likely to play with them, that's true, but the long-term design of the class feels very interdependent because of it. and not in an interesting way. You can build features that play well together and encourage combined usage without simultaneously making not engaging with the combo feel bad. Barbarian's Brutal Strike and Rogue's Cunning Strike both do this excellently. But the thing is, there's nothing interesting happening here with Hunter's Mark. It's a very binary decision. Use Hunter's Mark and get value out of your features, or don't use it and don't get value out of your features. Yes, if you don't use it, you can cast other spells, and those spells might be better than Hunter's Mark, but why should half of your class features and what ultimately amounts to its core design anchor be gated behind you not also using another one of your features, that being spellcasting? It just makes no sense. This kind of circles us back to the original discussion. When your later class features don't seem fun or interesting or encourage a way of playing the game that feels at odds with the other things that you would rather be doing, it just feels like a bit of a miss. It appears that large strides have been made in terms of making straight classing much more viable in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Many more classes are giving you compelling reasons to stick with a class beyond a few levels, and I will admit that I love that they're doing that. I'm often the first to say that I am not an optimizer, but just because I'm not constantly riding the bleeding edge of min-max builds doesn't mean that I don't like to do cool stuff. The new PHB sees rogues getting features like Cunning and Devious Strike, and Barbarian is also receiving the new feature Brutal Strike, which is a replacement for the old Brutal Critical feature, which is actually another interesting element to this conversation. When we first saw the Barbarian revealed in UA 5, there was a lot of disappointment among the community that nothing was done about Brutal Critical. Engagement with the feature was gated behind rolling a critical hit, which may or may not happen, and then how good or bad the feature was for you was also determined by a die roll. And worst of all, it consumed 3 of the Barbarian's high-level features. This again serves the point that features that require a very specific trigger to work are often not considered all that fun, and those that take up so many feature slots while only providing menial upgrades are generally not considered to be worth engaging with. Tons of people complained that nothing was done about Brutal Critical, and lo and behold, in UA 7 we were met with Brutal Strikes. What this tells us is that people genuinely do care about high-level features, even if they might never play with them. The whole package speaks to the feeling of the class and what it's capable of, and many people want to play a class that feels complete and well-rounded, and not one that feels lacking, even if they never get there. When we talk about the quality of a class, we're often talking about the whole thing, not just the first few levels, and everything we've brought up so far speaks to that. Whether it's a class capstone being dependent on a single concentration spell, or something like Brutal Critical taking up 3 high-level feature slots and not providing all that much of an incentive to stick with Barbarian. Every feature is important, and every feature plays into our overall perception of a given class, even if we never get close to using those features. And this has probably always been true. The Brutal Strike discussion from Jeremy Crawford sheds some light on the fact that high-level play is something that is important to the team, more on this later, and it was part of their strategy to make straight classing at least somewhat more compelling. The challenge here, though, is that if they were to make straight classing so good that it was just objectively better than multiclassing, that would heavily limit build diversity and probably alienate a lot of players. So instead, they tried to provide reasonably compelling high-level features that make it at least somewhat worth it for you to straight class if you were so inclined, or just don't care about optimization. But those very same features also function as that invisible hand, letting players know that, hey, from here on out, things are pretty mundane, so feel free to shop around elsewhere. I will say that, from what we know, seeing where exactly that invisible hand lives has become at least somewhat more challenging, which I think is a good thing. But it's still definitely there and still definitely influencing us even if we don't realize it. Now, there is an interesting element to this. Jeremy Crawford has stated that one of the goals of D&D moving forward is to provide more support for high-level play. Though we don't know precisely what that looks like just yet, we do know that, for the most part at least, classes have had their higher-level features improved in big ways, including the Bard, though I'm not sure that could have gotten much worse. Anyway, the first adventure that we saw released this year, Vecna, Eve of Ruin, is an adventure designed for characters levels 10 through 20. Other than Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage, this is the first time in 5e that we're seeing a pre-written module hit the top level in the game. More importantly though, it isn't a 1 to 20, it's a 10 to 20. This is significant because it gives players a much easier road into features that they may otherwise never get to use, including things like Relentless Hunter, Precise Hunter, and Foe Slayer. I fully expect that we'll see more of these types of adventures in the future, which I think is a good thing. I'm sure there's a lot of players that want to experience high-level play, but don't want to go through the early levels for the umpteenth time. Or they just don't want it to take years to get there. Or there's also definitely plenty of DMs that just want to have something that they can pick up off the shelf and run into the late game without needing to be god-tier world builders. So what am I getting at with all this? Really, it's just that people say all the time that high-level features don't matter since no one uses them. I've said similar things on this channel before, and my group is literally playing there, but I think it's something of a disingenuous statement. Yes, it's true that most people aren't hitting high levels, but that doesn't make their existence useless. If they were, D&D wouldn't have 20 levels, they would cut it down to 10 or something closer to that. The features exist to help guide the class and the player, and to give them something very real and tangible to look forward to in the late game. They exist to rein in the power on lower level features, as the ceiling has to be defined by the endgame, and also, they're aspirational. When I talk about the invisible hand of D&D, I don't imagine it as some nefarious evil looming over the game. It's a design tool that I believe Wizards of the Coast is acutely aware of. The vast majority of first-party content is designed for the early to mid-game. They want you to play there. Most people find those levels the most fun because things tend to get a little bit chaotic the higher up that you get. And while WotC knows that some players will play there, it seems clear that they still want the bulk of the action to take place at or before 10th level. As I mentioned, and to their credit, I do think they've done a mostly good job at enabling play at higher levels, thereby masking the hand to some degree. I even believe that they thought focusing on Hunter's Mark was going to incentivize people to want to play the class deeper. And I'm not saying that they won't. I'm just saying that they've created an incredibly rigid design framework to work from moving forward with future subclasses. I find it truly fascinating to think about the subtle influence that a rarely experienced element of the game has on our decision-making process and how it can shape our perception of classes and game mechanics overall. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing to help me reach that goal of 10,000 by the time that the new PHP comes out. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.